Welcome to From Generation to Generation, the Upbringing and Art of Mimi Gross. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. All our virtual programs are free of charge. Your support makes our work possible. Thank you. I'm excited and honored to introduce today's speakers. Mimi Gross is a painter, as well as a set and costume designer and maker of interior and exterior installations. She has lived and worked in Tribeca for the last 40 years and is known especially for her portraiture and for working with oil crayon and chalk pastel, in addition to oil paint. She held the Macmillan Stewart Endowed Chair in Painting at the Maryland College of Art in 2010 and 11, and has taught at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Rhode Island School of Design, the Penland School of Crafts, Syracuse University, SUNY Purchase, as well as other universities and educational institutions, giving workshops and advising students as a visiting artist. Gross's work can be found in the collections of the Jewish Museum, New York, the New York Public Library, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. She is the recipient of awards and grants, including from the New York State Council of the Arts, the National Endowment for Visual Arts, the American Academy, and Institute of Arts and Letters, and a Bessie for sets and costumes. Gross grew up in South Harlem in Manhattan. Her father was Chaim Gross. Louise Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across a range of disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He's the former director of the Renee National Jewish Museum and has curated more than 90 exhibitions across the country and overseas. He has authored or edited 25 books and several hundred articles and essays. Recent volumes include Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, and Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Ceremonies, and Customs from the Bnei Israel to the Art of Siona Benjamin. Dr. Soltes knows Mimi Gross since the 1980s and knew her father and mother, Chaim and Renee, well. I let him tell this history himself. After Ori speaks about Mimi and her work, Mimi will give us a brief tour through her studio, followed by a conversation between Mimi and Ori. At the end of today's event, we'll have time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Mimi and Ori.
Hi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with Rachel again, and of course with Mimi again. The first time I saw Mimi Gross's work was in the process of organizing an exhibition on the work of Chaim and Mimi Gross, so father and daughter. It was the first exhibition that I curated when I was the director at the Klutznick Museum back in 1991. And it was quite extraordinary. It was quite enlightening. It was quite mind and not just eye-opening to see these two similar and yet completely different artists from New York, which when Mimi was growing up was in the process of becoming the center of the art world. It had supplanted in the course of World War II, it had supplanted Paris as that center. And both Mimi's parents, Chaim and Renee Gross, were immigrants to New York. And there Chaim became an artist. He was already in the process of becoming one before he left Europe, but he really flourished. He taught, he created, he's credited with reviving the whole idea of direct carving into wood as a primary medium of sculpture. He did other modes as well, but that's the thing for which he became well known. And now I am sharing screen with you all. And you can see just one of his images. It's a ballerina And I chose it for two reasons. It's wood, and he worked in different woods, and he loved working woods. He loved working the grains that formed a kind of consonance with the shapes that he was coming up with. But also because this figure is called a ballerina. And if there is any kind of female one might suppose would be extraordinarily thin, it would be a ballerina. And he's given her a fairly narrow waist, but it's very much a Chaim Gross female, which is to say extremely robust. And I'm showing you the image because obviously growing up in his household, growing up visiting his studio, Mimi is likely to have had some influence from Chaim Gross. And one of the questions we'll want to ask is what kind of influence? And the second image that I would like to show you, which is pre-Mimi, is one by Red Grooms. It's one of his creations that depicts the Strand bookstore.
That's a recent piece.
Yeah, this is more recent. Yeah, but classic of the style for which he's known, which is to say you have what you can't quite tell is it two-dimensional, is it three-dimensional? It pulls out at you in a literal way and not just in a metaphorical way. And this is the sort of thing for which he became famous many decades ago, pop-up city scenes, pop-up like city scenes. But here's the thing, he was married to Mimi Gross in 1963. So Mimi was 23 at that point, and he would have been 26 or so. And by the way, they have a daughter as well, Saskia. And we see an image of them together by Alice Neal. So if you want to get a sense of them, here's Red and Mimi. He's the one to the left, she's the one to the right, in case you didn't figure that out on your own. And this image, a kind of tappy feet image from about the same time as Alice Neal's painting of them, this is 68 to 70, is credited to both of them. And if you did not know anything about anything except you'd heard of Red Grooms and you looked him up and you saw the kind of work for which he is renowned, you'd think, oh, it's a Red Grooms piece. And then who's Mimi? Because I have to point out that on the internet website for Red Grooms, she's not even mentioned as his wife. She was more than his wife. She was the innovator behind this kind of style. When I was organizing that exhibit in 1991, I can't find an image of it, but I can tell you what I found in the Hirshhorn storage, which was part of the exhibition, an early Mimi Gross piece, which is in this kind of a style, with this pop out, with this pull out, with this push out, with this transformation and translation of the concept of painting and the concept of sculpture, the one two-dimensional, the other three-dimensional, into a piece that not only is both and neither, but really resonates all the way back, all the way back, all the way back to the way in which the ancient Greeks in their relief statuary were always thinking about how they can give you the illusion of three dimensions in two. It's flat because it's on a surface, it's not freestanding, and yet it comes out at you bulbously because it's a sculpture. Mimi is the one who took this idea and translated and transformed it, and Red is the one who eventually became better known for it. But it's important to acknowledge that at the very least, we're talking here influence and counter-influence. Of course, Mimi was influenced by a lot of different artists because every artist worth his or her salt is, and she is, aside from being an artist, a scholar of art and its history. Rothko, what does Rothko have to do with Mimi? Look at the way the color pops out at you against the background of what is behind it, out of the restraining background color. The attenuated figures of Byzantine art, the issues in Italian Renaissance art that are discussed by Alberti in his treatise of 1435 about how you create the illusion on a flat surface of three-dimensional space with volumetric flesh and blood figures and objects moving about in it, through this whole series of his description of orthogonals and the vanishing point, all that business. And you can see how this plays out in a very literal way, although the image is kind of small for you to see. This is Perugino's Jesus handing the keys to St. Peter on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. But what you can see is that some art historian, this isn't Perugino, has indicated the way Perugino has followed the Albertine instruction of those orthogonals all coming to a point at the horizon, which we call the vanishing point. So what we see, or what we're going to see with Mimi, is that she takes these ideas and she, again, transforms them, because if you blur the line between painting and sculpture, you're blurring the line between the issue of flat surface and 3 dimensions. And you can do that in ways beyond what Alberti dreamed. She is well aware of the whole history of Western art. Poussin, for example, one of his more iconic works, The Rape of the Sabine Women, where you can see he has much more informally put into play the kind of ideas that Alberti was describing 2 centuries earlier. This is from 1633-34, where we have a cacophony of human figures and all the irregularities up against and pushing toward this kind of staid and stable backdrop of architecture. And then beyond it, again, a kind of cacophony of the clouds. Keep this in mind. Think about the Impressionists and their interest in having the viewer become part of the completion of the work. It's not about the product, it's about the process. This also influences Mimi very much. Or the way when we get into the early 20th century, an artist like Matisse famously flattens everything out. So he turns Alberti backwards. You have no illusion that you're looking into space at volumetric figures here. You are being told, your eyes are being told, you're looking at a flat surface, you're looking at a painting. Even the figures are flattened deliberately so as to emphasize instead the colors, the lines, the forms, and not this kind of chiaroscuro rounding that gives you that illusion of volumetricity. Mimi includes the humor of Saul Steinberg. She includes the energy of her contemporary, Elizabeth Murray. Here's one work by Elizabeth Murray, Do the Dance from 2005. And you can see energy, you can see color, you can see all sorts of chaos going on within a carefully prescribed order. So Mimi's art, Mimi Gross's art, is not an art of dialogue, it's an art of polylogue. So dia means 2, poly means many. It's many conversations going on simultaneously with art history, with artists in art history in their own relationship to history and to their own culture, her discussion of her own time and places. And she does this directly, and sometimes she does this obliquely. Art is, after all, a revision of reality. What is happening outside the canvas or outside the block of stone or wood is revisioned by the artist in the terms and forms that she imposes on that canvas or on that block of stone or wood or whatever the medium is. And Mimi Gross's media are plural: paintings, drawings, sculptures, just for starters. And if we look, for example, almost arbitrarily chosen at this wonderful feel-good flower, quick, tell me, is it a painting or is it a sculpture? Oh, it must be a painting. Look, it's all this color stuff back on the against the white ground. And then, oh, wait, it's got a base. Oh, it's a sculpture. The fact of the matter is, it's both. On the other hand, other forms of nature interest her, both rural scenes and the urban nature of New York in particular, but above all, people in all kinds of times, places, ways, modes, means, media. So Winter Evening, it's a drawing on the one hand. On the other hand, there's very moving work of Aaron Jackson Jr., 10 years old. It's part of the Lost Atlantis series she did, because Mimi's work is not only aesthetic, it's also socio-political, again and again, not always, but often when it needs to be, when she wants it to be. More about that in a few moments. You may be aware, you may remember that between 1979 and 1981, at least 30 African-American children and young adults were abducted and murdered in Atlanta. So this is part of a series that is a kind of homage to them, lest they be forgotten. And conversely, very differently, and of course, full color, Yvonne Jacquet and baby Tom Burkhart in Maine, one of the places that is near and dear to Mimi, I know, and people who are near and dear to her, and an imagery which is neither exactly what you might expect, because there's a certain degree of distortion, and at the same time, it's very clear what it is: the figurative, the color, the vibratory shaping, this kind of peaceful chaos with which is represented by a mother in that chair with her baby, whom you can feel as restive, trying to kind of squirm a little bit in that wonderful bright red piece of clothing. or a whole array of women in her Arlene Raven art group work, or, and this one I'm particularly fond of, it's early-ish, it's 1964, so Mimi's 24 at that time. This is just the year after she married Red Grooms, if you're looking for other markers of time. It's Horn and Hard art. So what is Horn and Hard art? Well, some of us are old enough to remember this is an iconic place where you went for coffee and snacks in New York City. But also look at the way she has vibrated the color scheme, and also look at the way she's playing with this whole Albertian idea of perspective, the way the floor tiles move in a manner to suggest, but of course not be precisely arithmetically consistent with an Albertian prescription. And most of all, your eye is drawn to that central figure who is coming right out at you, right out at us. And we're looking over the shoulders of everyone else toward her, and beyond her the doors, beyond that the street, and suddenly realize that the walls, the windows seem to dissolve toward the streets. So we have, on the one hand, a full 360-degree circularity at which we stand at one end, and she stands at the other, and those behind her still further at that other. And on the other hand, perspective is not the issue here. It's about feeling, it's about form, it's about color, it's about a kind of excitement coming in from the cold to get your coffee and what have you. It is revision. It is looking at earlier iconic artworks that mark some of what she does, Albertian theory that she plays with, the blurring of the lines between painting and sculpture, the blurring of the lines between illusion and reality, which of course in a certain sense is what art does in any case. It transforms reality in ways that can be illusory, or ways that can have as their intention to give you the illusion that you're seeing reality, or have as their intention to force you to acknowledge that you're looking at a painting that is something different from reality, and figure out or just feel how that might be. So remember that Poussin Rape of the Sabines that I showed you a moment back? Well, here's an early sketch for an idea that she was cooking in her head as to how to play with that. So in this particular sketch, we don't have the buildings he had. We have this one structure that smells of Wall Street. And then what eventuates is this magnificent oil on wood of the Rape of the Sabines, but she has transformed it. Look how stuff is coming off the edge. And you can't quite see from this image the way the floor kind of comes down and out at you. So the whole thing is three-dimensionalized, and then it becomes literally three-dimensionalized in another version. And my favorite, of which we have no image, it is currently in storage. I guess it was last shown when we showed it in '91 in Washington. Is that correct, Mimi? And
Yes.
it's when she took the idea and transformed it two ways. First of all, she just changed it visually and pulled it out as a series of flattened figures, creating a kind of three-dimensionality by default out of two-dimensional kind of figures. But also it was not the Rape of the Sabines, it was the famous riots that broke out in Tompkins Square Park in the summer of 1988. And it's that which she did. And in fact, the title of that version, which I cannot show you because we don't have it imaged, is Riot at Tompkins Square Park. And actually, that's the polite name for it. Look it up. You'll see what the actual less polite name is, that Rachel would be upset with me if I repeat it in front of the camera. So I shan't.
It's actually 9 feet by 9 feet by 9 feet.
Huge.
It's
So
much more dimensional.
exactly. So you actually, it's almost as if you're inside it when you come up close to it. And this you may recognize as another iconic image from the 19th century from Delacroix, the women of Algiers, this whole interest in the exotic other of which Delacroix was part. And Mimi does, first of all, her own version of it. And just at quick glance, you realize at the very least, it's different because this is a vertical image, whereas Delacroix's is a horizontal image. And of course, there are other things as well. But let's cut to the chase. She ends up with this work called Dark Air, where the whole idea of light, which is what's so obsessing Delacroix as a student of North Africa, or would come to obsess the Impressionists later on, but she calls it dark air. So she's kind of reversed that idea. But she has given us a series of figures. It's a tableau as they come out to us, not just metaphorically, but literally. And each of these figures, of course, is a personal friend of hers who has posed. So the Renaissance artists often used the faces of those they knew for the scenes they created. There's a famous story about Leonardo da Vinci threatening some guy who was hassling him because his Last Supper in Milan was taking him too long to complete. He said, okay, I'm going to get it done. By the way, you're going to be Judas. And suddenly the guy stepped back and said, no, I don't want to be immortalized as Judas. So she has followed that pattern as well, but of course, taking it in her own contemporary direction. And just when you think you've got her figured out, she's taken a flat painting and three-dimensionalizes it. She tricks you. So this you recognize as that 1881-82 famous iconic painting by Manet, the bar at the Folly Berger. And its idea is kind of to play with 2 and 3 dimensions in that you are staring at her as the guy at the bar whom you see here reflected in the mirror behind her. She doesn't look happy. In fact, look at the coloration. She looks like another of the bottles or the pieces of fruit. She's just an object of his delectation and pleasure, the way the drink and the food is. And what have we here? Mimi's take on this. So whereas she can go from 2 to 3 dimensions on a dime, she can twist in the other direction and take a painting that is designed to pretend to give you the illusion of 3 dimensions, and she plays exactly with the same form, and yet she has, in a particular way, reduced it to 2 dimensions even more fundamentally. But where is this done for? It was done for the restaurant, for the bar of O'Neill's up near Lincoln Center, right?
It's a mirror. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you became the person.
Exactly. So now literally we have become the person who is not only looking at this, but whereas we were metaphorically the person who was looking at the barkeeper in the Manet painting, we are now actually the person at the bar looking at her beyond the bar, reflecting back at us, this wonderful pastel drawing. And I noticed you have other works there now as well, but that's another story for another day. All kinds of directions. Everyone knows this icon, right? This is Norman Rockwell. It's this American Thanksgiving. It's part of the series called The 4 Freedoms. It's the idea is how well we are. Look at us, that big turkey and all those nice scrubbed, all of them white faces looking out at us. And Mimi does this extraordinary expansion of the idea of the blur between 2 and 3 dimensions, the blur between painting and sculpture, the blur between you being outside looking at the art and inside becoming part of the art, in this enormous installation called The Arrival, 1620, which reminds us what, of course, too often we forget. Thanksgiving is not just about those nicely scrubbed Midwestern white faces. It's also about other kinds of faces and different forms of installation. This is just an enormous, spectacular kind of contrivance that carries onto the walls, across the floors, around the space through which you work and walk, so that you literally become part of the arrival, or you part of those receiving those who have arrived. And the myths about how that interface happened and the realities about what happened become part and parcel of the subtext of this textless text, this revisioned vision of a moment in history, which is itself iconic. Well, all of this, of course, reminds us that there is a very thin line between these media of painting and drawing and the whole idea of theater. Theater provides you with a stage where you're looking at events in a volumetric space with 3-dimensional flesh and blood figures and objects within them moving about. And there's a certain sense in which it's an illusion because it's on the stage, it's theater. At the same time, the issues that are engaged most often, if the play succeeds, resonate for us who are sitting in the theater, and sometimes you have a playwright like Shakespeare who gives you a play within a play, as in Hamlet, for example. And that might cause an astute audience member to think the following question: am I really just a player within a play? Is there a larger audience beyond me, whether you want to call it God or whatever you want to call it? So should it surprise us that another direction completely of Mimi's work is sets? Well, this is a set, not of a play. This a set of the Success Garden, done in 1993, here installed at Port Authority bus terminal. How more ironic could you be than in that most banal of places, the bus terminal, this spectacular, exquisite setting, which in being a garden, not just a garden of success, but garden always has the potential connotation of the Garden of Eden, paradise, paradise within the midst of Port Authority bus terminal, public spaces, again, through which people move. So we become part of the play as we become part of the art. And so she designs also stage sets and costumes. And here we're seeing a detail from Cassation, or is it Cassations, from 2012, Douglas Dunn and Dancers. And you can see from our perspective, we assume, right, that this is the audience. But if we have no knowledge, for all we know, they're part of the setting there, because we have actors, we have sets. Where does the sets, where does the stage, and where do the actors end? Where does the art end? Where does the viewer begin? Where does the audience begin? Or another beautiful moment visually within this part of her oeuvre called the Songs of the Senses. So Mimi is about life and theater. She's about life as theater. She's about theater as life. She's about painting as sculpture. She's about sculpture as painting. She's about drawing as sculpture. She's about urban contexts. Goodbye, Times Square, in this fabulous work, this incredibly detailed work. It is the extraordinary excitement with the place where I began my comments, which is, of course, New York and the heart of New York, which is part of her life, just as she is a woman for all seasons and an interest in nature in all of its seasons. So here we have spring, for example, and different medium, different style. Here we have summer, for example. All of these times and places are part of the extraordinary way in which Mimi Gross, as an extraordinary artist, creative, clever, imaginative, and impresario of time and space, and a magician stirring a magnificent brew, for which I think we should be duly grateful. Thank you all.
What an exaggeration.
So our next stop is the video that Brittany is going to run for us, that was done recently of Mimi's studio, and she's actually going to walk and talk us through it. So Brittany, can you take that away?
Well, this is where I've been recently painting. It's the corner I picked in this big studio. This is all oil paint, and the little cups are covering the wet paint. These are recent painting. On the left is the fabric dyers in West Africa that I witnessed, and on the, that's a detail of painting. This is the most.
You've been all over, haven't you? By the
Well,
way,
one of the most colorful sites. These are the rinsing the dyed fabrics. This is a series. Above are anatomical images that are part of a park that in Brooklyn, in East New York, Brooklyn. This is the park itself. And you can see the ear is one of the screens. This is a very recent landscape with its model. And this was a purchase I made in West Africa and decided to do portraits of people sitting in this exotic chair. These are all recent portraits. oil paint, and some drawings. The drawing of FDR was actually not recent. It's from the Life magazine. The thing to fear is fear itself. This is my pandemic project of the park in Chinatown, which I made drawings for several years of the elderly people in Chinatown and all their activities. And it's Chinatown is dying as a neighborhood, and this is a remembrance of how the active park is Columbus Park, that's between Baxter and Mulberry Street, and is still quite active. Dr. Sun Yat-sen is a sculpture in the middle of the park, and it says, "All under heaven are equal." This is my living room, as it were, and it has a watercolor by my father that I recently bought. This is by all different people. So this is and from the studio to the house living part. This is my father's sculpture on the left. And the great toy collection that belongs to our daughter Saskia. This is me and Saskia on the West Side Highway. And this is the first image I had published in a magazine in Italy, where I was living in 1960, 61. This is a movie, Fat Feet, that was made with Red and Yvonne Anderson. This is from Ruckus, Manhattan. It's the Miss Liberty. And this was an art on the beach. This is now a big city. And the circus was also on the beach. I did all the decorations for Big Apple Circus. This is from Ward's Island. It was public art. This is American servicemen who died. And this is a dance called Aerobia, Cassations, for which I did costumes and sets. This is another dance that wasn't. These cloud paintings were shown in a hospital in Kentucky. This is from the Arrival. It's one of the Wampano peoples. It had about 30 sculptures. And I focused on the Wampano people. Here are my granddaughters and my daughter Saskia, Sarah and Layla, and their dad, Rob, in Minneapolis, where Sarah's lived. This is my most recent pieces. You saw one of them on the bottom right, but now there's others. I think there's 5 altogether. They are 2D in this image, but I have one right here. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. I was going to show it to you.
Yeah, we can see a little bit. Yeah.
You can see it sideways.
Yeah, there you go. That's great. Fantastic. You know, there used to be,
These are the maquettes.
I have a question for you. I mean,
Please.
we have a lot of questions for you.
Please.
That last one just provoked one. There were, particularly the late 19th, early 20th century, at the Jewish New Year, they would have these cards, and sometimes they were these fancy, multi-layered New Year's cards. Do you remember those? I just wonder if.
I remember Saul Steinberg had several. The life of a person, of a male person, and it would be in steps. So the baby born, the bar mitzvah child, then the marriage, and then children, and go down till he died.
Huh. So let me ask you a question. Growing up in the home of Chaim and Renee Gross, do you have a sense, or do you remember having had a sense, and the answer could be no, of things being in a particular way because they were both immigrants? I mean, you're born in New York. They came from elsewhere, and with not necessarily happy memories of some of the experiences. I know more about your father than your mother in that regard. He's 12 years old and he sees his father being beaten by Cossacks or what have you.
Yeah.
But did you get a sense that was the fact that they were immigrants a factor in anything about how they raised you?
Well, I wanted to particularly mention that I remember in my elementary school class, 80 different countries were first generation Americans.
Wow.
As I and my brother are. So that gives you a perspective that we're not alone in having parents who are
Right.
perhaps not typically American. But yes, it's a pervasive atmosphere that we lived in.
Yeah.
It's like there was a shadow of sadness from the past. It just was the history of their characters.
But I guess on the other hand, as you just say, it wouldn't have seemed any out of the ordinary at all because you were surrounded by kids like yourself who had parents like your parents who were immigrants.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's one of the wonderful things about New York. How about your brother? Tell me a little about him, because you grew up, you from early on wanted to be an artist. That's not the direction he chose to take, although I know music is something that he's very connected to, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he's an expert on the blues. He became an engineer, and that was the career that he followed. Now he's 87 or 86, and he retired, and he is a practicing Orthodox Jewish person. So he studies a lot, takes care of his families.
Cool.
Seems to be quite content right now. He's totally healthy, etc.
Wonderful. I recall your having said back in 1991, this was in the essay that I wrote, so I wouldn't have otherwise necessarily remembered it from that far back, but you commented on that your father used to love talking about your art as punk art, although you said he probably didn't really understand what that word meant. Can you say a little more about that?
He basically dismissed me in that way. He didn't know what it meant, right? But he just liked the word.
Yeah, I guess his style is very different. I'm sorry?
Yeah, feel contemporary.
Well, it all goes, you know.
Punk era at that time.
Sure, absolutely. And you obviously grew up not only in your parents' house, but in your parents' milieu, which was suffused with a lot of artists. How's this for a question? Do you have a particular artist or artist, I mean, as people and not even necessarily as artists from among that group who are or were or was your favorite or your favorites?
Several.
Go for it.
I mean, mainly it was male artists, which is very interesting, but among them was Louise Nelson, who had been a student of my father's, and she was always a lifetime friend. And when Red and I separated, she was hugely encouraging to me. She really said, go for it and don't listen to anybody. And she was very, very, very strong about it. And I remember that and appreciate it even after all this time.
That's great.
One of the artists who was kind of like another father was Raphael Sawyer, a great figurative painter. And I posed for him quite a bit. And we got to know each other. And he followed an ethic that my father had, and which influenced me, and I think also Red. It's a work ethic that you wake up in the morning and that's what you think about all day, and you do it to your work.
And
for better or worse, whether it's commercial or not.
Right. And you obviously knew the other Sawyer brothers as well, but Raphael was the one whom you were with.
They were a very close family.
Yeah.
But Rafe and Moses, I knew he was actually my father's best friend, and his studio was nearby, so I did see him, and he painted me as well.
Fantastic. And Louise Nelson makes me think of Maine, of course, because that's where she was originally from. And I do remember when my first book, which was on Jewish American painters in the 20th century, I don't remember how I figured out to include her in it, but she didn't want to be in it because she didn't want to be associated with a group that was called Jewish, which was not all that unusual
Well, she's
for
right.
American Jewish artists. I'm sorry?
She's right in a way.
Yeah,
Same as being a woman artist. She was a great artist, period.
exactly, exactly.
Was.
And is your relationship to Maine, obviously not because of her, but that image that I showed of Yvonne Jacquet and baby Tom Burkhart, that was
That-
me.
Long time ago,
Yeah.
64. I only spent a few summers in Maine.
Mhm.
I've been more in Cape Cod and Provincetown.
So tell me a little bit more about your travels, because just from what we saw in your studio, we got a little bit of a sense of where you've been or what
Well,
has inspired you.
Influences from my father in particular was curiosity. He was an extremely curious person, and so am I. And traveling is part of the curiosity, to see the world, to see people, although everybody's basically the same, it was great to see different cultures. So I've been in Asia, and I've been in Africa, and I've been in Europe, South America.
So you've been around.
Not recently.
Good enough. And part of what we saw in your studio just now, and I just showed a few in what I said, was portraits. Have portraits always been a thing for you?
Yes, since I'm a little girl. I used to sell portraits as a child, and people kept them. But it sort of weaves in and out with time. Like, I'm not making portraits all the time, but I like to do them, and it's a form of collaboration with my friends. While doing the portrait, you get to know each other better and talk about life as well as art, or art and life, same thing.
And tell us a little about Douglas Dunn and your relationship with the dance world and the theater world and all of that.
Actually, we're currently working on a new piece. He's performing tonight, if anybody is available, at 6:30 at 541 Broadway. We're working on a piece for April, that's early spring, and I'll do the set and costumes for 7 dancers.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of seeing color, 3-dimensional, the real thing, and not just flat. And I love the dancers very much, and I love his work. We have collaborated since the late 70s, on and off all these years, although he has worked with many other artists, including the great Charlie Atlas. And he's very inventive. He's a little bit younger than I am, and he's dancing as I'm painting.
Fantastic. And how much did you and Red Grooms collaborate on work? I mean, I obviously mentioned that a little bit, and I showed a work that is ascribed to the two of you together. That
particular work you showed was a title for the movie Tappy Toes.
Right.
And it shows in the film, each character has a balloon as to who they are in the movie. And the Tappy Toes is a movie based on our installation that was made in Chicago, Portrait of Chicago, the Windy City. And it's now in the Art Institute collection. From when we first really got together, we were 24/7 collaborators.
Wow.
So everything we did together, we did really work all the time. He revolutionized his schedule. It doesn't work 24/7 as much as he used to, and neither do I.
Neither do any of us, I suppose.
We made quite a few movies together, and after we separated, both of us didn't make more movies. That was a sort of strange fact.
Yeah.
And the movies are, they're imaginary movies. They didn't really look like documentaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would imagine they had quite an artistic touch to them that isn't always and necessarily present in documentaries. No?
There are a couple documentaries, come to think of it, but basically it's all animation and made up sense.
So once again, illusion and reality in yet another dimension. So you do work in many dimensions.
Yes, that big piece of Reds of the Strand bookstore is very recent.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And I hope people saw when the camera panned, it was pretty quick through your studio. They might have gotten a sense of how large Dark Air is. It's a huge piece.
It's about 12 feet by 9 feet high by, I guess, about 5 feet deep.
So you work in all kinds of scales as well, right?
Did I show that in Washington, by the way?
Yes, yes, you did. Oh yeah, it was a knockout.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. So you work from the smallest to
That's
the largest.
the only time I did a show with my father, and it was planned before he died,
Yes,
and then he died.
right.
We did the show shortly after that.
Well, you know, if you remember, the underlying idea of that exhibition was intimations of immortality, playing on the Wordsworth poem, and then playing on the idea that an artist is immortalized by the work that he or she leaves behind. A parent is immortalized by the children that he or she leaves behind. An artist parent who has an artist child is exponentially immortalized. And of course, it also creates the question, every child has to figure out how to be what he or she is, cannot not be influenced by having parents. It's the DNA for starters. But if you are an artist, no less, and your parent is an artist, so figuring out how to chart your own way is a challenge. And one of the things that I found over 20 years ago when we did that exhibit, and still find, and I'm not trying to just to flatter you, but one of the things that I find so extraordinary about your work is the ways in which you were surrounded by art and artists, and you found a very unique voice.
Thank you.
And didn't just, resonate from those around you. No, it's true. You were certainly as influenced by Poussin de la Croix and Polyclitus back in 5th century BC Athens as by Chaim Gross or Red Grooms or Raphael Sawyer or anybody else who is around you. And yet you are you.
Everyday life.
Yep. So with that, I would like to open the floor to questions, since I believe there may be some. And I see one has come up already. And, oh, that's just, is the chat disabled, was the question. So that I don't know, maybe it is. But if anyone has a question, this would be the time to ask. Or Rachel, perhaps you have a question, or even Brittany, you may have a question. Anyone is allowed. Joseph Levin, did Mimi's mother also have artistic ability? Lest we forget, Renee was a powerhouse. I can attest to that personally. But I'll let you answer that question, Mimi.
She was not literally an artist, but she had a tremendous understanding and vision with it, and a huge inspiration to my father in particular. She was always encouraging, and she did have an artistic personality, but making things was not her interest or her discipline.
Right. I do remember after your father died and you guys were discussing whether the studio should become a museum or this, that, the other thing. She was very involved in that project, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
She was behind it. There were a group of friends of my father's who started the foundation for one of his birthdays. And then when he died, it was a huge challenge whether we could continue it. It was financially, it's difficult. We ended up, after he died, selling 70 African art masterpieces, and that got us on our feet.
Wow. There's a second question. Do you remember how you came up with the idea of the 3D painting style? They look like dioramas. This is from Jenny Schlossman.
I was doing that as a child. I always liked to cut things out. And when I was in Europe, I saw so much Romanesque art, and that
Mhm.
inspired me a great deal. The Parthenon friezes inspired me. It just is like how to make a relief without carving. And so that was how the idea developed.
Wow, very interesting. Rachel,
So I've always been doing that.
lifelong.
Yeah, and yeah, and I'm also yeah, you always keep going back between the painting and the 3D installations, and I really loved your envisioning of the arrival in 1620, those settlers.
It's actually a video made by Jacob Burckhardt of the installation, and it's on my website.
Mhm.
My name. It's
And-
called
and-
Arrival 1620. I think it's about 8 or 9 minutes long.
Huh.
Mhm.
And just for my curiosity, am I correct in assuming that baby Tom Burckhardt depicted on Yvonne Jacquet's lap is Jacob Burckhardt's son?
Half brother.
Half brother. Okay.
Tom is a fantastic artist. He's in his mid-50s now, and I admire his work enormously. Jacob, his half brother, is a filmmaker. They have different moms, and mother Edith Schloss actually has a book published called The Loft Generation, which is her own memoir. It's a wonderful book. I
Wow.
recommend it. But Jacob's a filmmaker.
I have another question, unless there's, I don't want to deprive the audience. Yes, there's another one from Richard German, or Gorman, sorry. Are you concerned about the relative impermanence of the 3D, the paperworks?
Not concerned.
Okay. I have another biographical question for you, which also has to do with who and where you are now, because you were gone to, I think, Provincetown most of the summer. You ended up down on LaGuardia Place, but you started up on the Upper West Side, I think. How much of a migrant within the city were you? And if you think of home, is there a place in particular that you think of as home?
Heart.
Okay, so that would be wherever you go then.
Yes.
Home is wherever you pitch your tent, as one of my friends says.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
I did grow up in South Harlem, and my parents moved after I was in college. And so I didn't actually live in the house where the foundation is now, but I lived with the objects that are in the house.
Right.
Grew up with sculpture, both.
So all those objects, they created the home wherever the home was,
Yes.
would
Yes.
be,
And
is.
they're very familiar in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I have not been to your studio, but when I'm watching this, I'm thinking, wait, I've been there for parts of it, because it reminded me, parts of it reminded me of your father's studio, particularly obviously the parts where you've got his sculptures. But then I thought, no, this is completely different. So once again, even your surroundings, it strikes me, reflect where you come from, but at the same time, of course, what you yourself are as a complete individual, you know?
It's that subject of curiosity,
Yeah, exactly.
liking things and being interested in many things.
And does Saskia do art at all?
Currently she's been weaving. In
Uh-huh.
fact, I'm not wearing her beautiful scarf she just sent me. She's
Uh-huh.
wonderful, fantastic talent. She does collages and weaving, and she's interested. She just isn't professional about it
Mhm.
in terms of the world. She lives in southern Vermont.
And Alan Mann asks if there is any art form that you have not undertaken that you would like to experiment with or in.
Yes, I've thought recently I'd like to do more prints. I have worked with woodcuts and etchings and lithic. I just would like to do more etchings, I think, but I don't know if I will.
There's a question from Catherine Hellerstein, because she just got off a plane, so she missed earlier. She's late. She's wondering if you could say a few words about the paintings right behind you right now. I think you talked a little about that. Yeah, you did.
Mention them. Well, come and visit. The one that is sitting on top of the painting, though it's completely another piece, are my friends in Provincetown on the beach. And above that is a cloud, one of the many cloud works that I've done that's also dimensional. The painting right behind my shoulder is flat, and it's from West Africa of the dyers that we looked at in detail earlier. So Catherine, you could come and just sit.
That sounds wonderful. Absolutely terrific.
Yiddish scholar, Catherine Hellerstein.
And a great question from Cordula Hahn. Is Saskia called after Rembrandt's wife?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay. She gets the prize now. Rachel, remember to send her the prize. Well, thank you so very, very much, Mimi.
Well,
This
thank
was just a treat.
It was really interesting for me too. You said things I never knew that you were thinking before.
Ha. Well, I have to say, I'm not trying to flatter you, but your art inspires a lot of thinking. I mean, it's for me, it's sort of an ideal kind of art, because I can just respond to it, viscerally. I don't have to think at all because of how it works on my senses. But at the same time, there's a lot to think about if I want to. So it's the best of both worlds in that respect for me, anyway.
I'm very, very interested in that. You see it, then you wonder how it's made, and then why it's made, what it's about, what it might be about in the background, and so on.
Terrific.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this curiosity is, you can feel that throughout your work. Like it makes, I think it makes the viewer curious as well. If he isn't already.
You can also see it in my father's work, as he experimented with materials, and he was so interested in all different aspects of art and time.
Yes. Well, yes. And you could,
art, etc.
You could see that in his work. You could see that in your parents' apartment,
Yes.
Where they lived. It came from everywhere.
Just staying in this generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now Shelley is asking, she said she loved touring your father's home and studio, and she asked whether your studio is ever open for touring.
Well, we could work on a personal tour, of course. It's not for our foundation is literally open to the public.
Right.
And when they have open house, it's free and open to the public. Otherwise, it's there's a small admission fee, which helps our modest budget, and it's a tour. 4 floors of art and a staircase and a studio. It's a lot to see there.
Yes, indeed.
Chaim Gross Foundation. My mother's name is, people ask why her name is attached to it, since the focus is on my father's work, is that she was such a huge influence in making the foundation exist and for his work throughout their life together.
Yeah, very clearly so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I remember them both.
I fought hard to get her name on it. They wanted to call it Chaim Gross Studio Museum. And I said, well, it is that, but it's also Renee Gross.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you succeeded with that.
I love that. Yeah. And Marilyn Berger Mont Blanc says, thank you both for this very special presentation of the work of Mimi Gross. What a pleasant discovery for me, who has not until now followed her exciting views of the world in its universalities and particularities. I think there's a modest understated connection between the Gross and Soltes households. See, now comes this spoiler. My Sperber uncles brought back a copy of the Jewish holidays from visits to Chaim Gross with a foreword and text by Rabbi Abraham Soltes.
That's correct.
So,
That's my father.
Who is your father exactly?
So you forced me to tell you one small anecdote, and which my sister is listening, she will love. Back in the mid-'80s, I did a series of videos on, what is Jewish art? And so Chaim Gross was one of the artists whom I interviewed to address that question. And he left where we were shooting in the studio to go up to the kitchen for a moment to get something. His mic was still on. So he enters the kitchen, Mimi, and Renee says to him, "So new, how is he? Is he brilliant like his father?" And Chaim goes, "Eh." So we could all hear that. And of course, the whole crew got a great laugh out of that. So yes, I knew Chaim and Renee through my father, who first knew them. And you're right, that was a work where that series that he did, my father wrote the text for. So absolutely. Thank you.
What better story can we conclude this event with? Thank you so much, Mimi, first of all, and foremost.
And Brittany.
And Brittany, yes.
Brittany for being there for us.
And who shot the video of the studio.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you so much, everyone, and be well, stay well.
Good luck with your programs.
Thank you.
You.
Bye for now.
Bye.